Okay, everybody, good evening on Monday, the 22nd of February, 2020. This is Globetrotting with World Jewish Relief. And my name is Maurice Helfgott. I am delighted and have the privilege to recently become the chairman of World Jewish Relief. And my role in our proceedings this evening is to introduce our three magnificent speakers. World Jewish Relief, as you know, is an international humanitarian organization that helps Jews around the world and very much beyond. And one of the key things that World Jewish Relief is able to do is go on trips to understand the situation of beneficiaries around the world and to engage with them. And a number of you on this call, and I hope many of you in the future, will be able to take those trips with us in person. But at the moment, of course, that's not possible. So what we've done is we've set up a series of events called Globetrotting, from where we'll visit this evening Poland, then Georgia, then Bosnia and Uganda with experts in the field who will share a little bit about what is going on in those countries. This evening, our conversation is going to be led by the wonderful Rob Rinder. Rob, as you will probably all know, is a barrister, a TV personality, an influential author and influencer. And he has done an enormous amount of work in combating anti-Semitism and in making programs also about the Holocaust. I particularly am indebted to Rob for doing this event. He and I share some history. His grandfather, Moshe Malaniki, was one of the boys brought to Great Britain by World Jewish Relief in 1945 as an orphan refugee and rehabilitated here. And my father was also one of those boys. And so in very much a sense, we are both here in some part, an important part, due to World Jewish Relief. Rob and I have known each other a while, and we actually met when we were doing family trips to his grandfather and my father's hometown of Piotrków in Poland. And I'm very, very grateful that he will lead this conversation. He's going to lead it with the very charismatic community builder, Jonathan Orenstein, who's director of the Jewish Community Center in Krakow. The JCC was set up almost 10 years ago now, and was opened by the patron of World Jewish Relief, His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales. It's a project that you will learn more about this evening, but it has been a critical project in helping the flourishing of Jewish life again in Poland, seeded and supported by World Jewish Relief with his tremendous leadership. And Jonathan is also a very prominent international person who serves on the board of Child Survivors of the Holocaust organization. Our third participant is the photographer and historian, Edward Serotta. Edward is the director of Centropa, based in Vienna, and he's been specializing in the history of Jews in Central Europe for more than 30 years. If you haven't had the opportunity to go online and see some of Edward's very, very special photographs, I very much encourage you to do so after this program. He has captured the images and continues to capture the images of Jewish life, and it's very moving and important. So with no further ado, I'd like to welcome and hand over to Rob. The conversation is going to last for about 40 minutes. Then you'll have an opportunity to ask questions. I'll facilitate those, and then we'll wrap it up at 8:30. Over to you, Rob.
Good evening, Maurice. Thank you so much for having me. I have to say, there are disproportionate, some might say innumerable privileges of having any kind of public platform, but this is perhaps the greatest gift of all of them. You described as a new president, and I don't want to correct you, of World Jewish Relief, that WJR was an organization, and of course that's true, and it's an impressive and critical one to be sure. But I being a barrister, would like to submit that it's more than that. It's something more profound. It's mishpocha. It's a family, because it centered World Jewish Relief on the fundamental principle that Jews are responsible for each other and the wider world. And as I increasingly am asked to think about ways in which we might combat the tragic and dark cloud of anti-Semitism, I always invite people not necessarily to look immediately to the logical arguments, but always to be ready to deploy quality examples of who we are as a people, nationally and internationally at our best. And the example that I always have and come back to is World Jewish Relief. We represent that response. It's impossible, or certainly very difficult, to think of a more articulate expression of who we can be in terms of our responsibility to each other, the diaspora, and of course to communities beyond our own, than the work that WJR does. And as you rightly say, the threads of WJR have woven into the tapestry of my life, because of course they provided the lifeline to my grandfather when he landed in this country, as did your father, Maurice. And above all, it gifted him new life, the capacity to understand, to believe that he had a future. And without WJR, having had the gift and chance to look at some of the records that I now know and I saw, and the work that they did in bringing him back to humanity, without that, it's impossible to think where he would be. So it is a real gift and a privilege and a joy to be here tonight alongside not an organization, not Tzedakah, but part of this broad family. Now, tonight we land in Poland, and I'm privileged to have two experts. And so this is really a chance for me to ask questions that I've been wanting to ask for some time. We land in Poland, and I should say that Poland often, for many people who haven't been there but have either an incidental connection to life in Poland, perhaps they have relatives who have been there but have never stood on the ground. Often there's a complex relationship or a misunderstood thought or a misunderstood sense of what the history of Poland is now, which Jonathan will talk about, and certainly was in the past, that Edward will speak to. And I know that I had a confused, perhaps an ambivalent feeling towards Poland, very informed by my grandfather's views on Poland when he came to this country, and a view that never changed throughout his life. So when I went back to make my 3 documentaries about Poland, what was fascinating was how that changed. And what I'm hoping for tonight is that Edward and Jonathan are going to be able to illuminate the past and the present, to give us a new, broader understanding of the rich complexion of that country, a country that was the cradle of Jewish life for centuries, rather than perhaps how it's been come to understood as the cradle of nothing more than anti-Semitism and prejudice. And I'm really looking for those colors tonight. And I hope when we come away, we think deeply about Poland, what it was, what it is now, and from Jonathan, even what it can be. Edward, I'm going to turn to you first as a historian. I should say, when I arrived in Poland, the first book I was given was a record. And it turned out that my grandfather, whose surname was Malonitsky, came from the town of Malonik in 1700. And that immediately was a surprise. It came from a town to Pietrzykov-Trybunalski, incidentally, which is interesting for me because it was a court town. But that immediately triggered something which I hadn't thought about, was really the deep roots of Jewish life in Poland, reaching far beyond 100 years, where it's often presented through the prism of the shtetl. When we think about it in the context of English history, beyond the times of the early modern period, the Tudors, etc. And I think it's important to give us an understanding of that. Edward, when did Jewish life begin in Poland, and how did it grow?
Well, we know, by the way, thanks to everyone for having me. It's always a pleasure to be talking for World Jewish Relief, an organization that I've enjoyed doing projects with for many years, going back well over 20-something years. And as you can tell from my accent, I'm not from your neighborhood. I'm from the holy city of Savannah, Georgia. And I've lived in Europe for 30-something years. I've spent quite a bit of time in Poland and all of Central and Eastern Europe. As a matter of fact, this is the only place I do know, is this region. Jews in Poland, there's evidence of traders that had been in Poland for up to 1,000 years ago. But what we really know is that it was in the 14th century under Kazimierz the Great, that was when he was building a stronger Poland, a kingdom, that he welcomed Jews. And we have evidence, and we have the decrees of laws that he passed welcoming Jews into his territory, into his kingdom in 1346. And this would be the beginning. And of course, like all empires, they grow, they expand, and they fail. And in Poland, what we had with Kazimierz the Great is the Piasts fell, the Agilonians came up. Then there would be those that came after them, and all this time Jews settled in various parts of the kingdom. Now, as we all know, geography is destiny, and Poland always had this unfortunate position of being, most of it, flat as a pancake, and between two greater powers, between the Hohenzollerns on one side, the Germans on one side, and the Russians on the other, the Romanovs. And this would cause Poland endless trouble. I live in Vienna now. In 1683, when the Ottoman Turks had surrounded Vienna and were about to take it, King Jan Sobieski from Poland galloped out of the Vienna woods with his famous cavalry, chased the Ottomans away. And when the Ottomans left, by the way, they left big sacks of brown beans, which people came out and sniffed and said, let's open a coffee house. And that's where that comes from. But if geography is destiny, there's one thing that doesn't exist in history and in politics, and that's gratitude. While the Poles certainly saved the Austrians and the Habsburgs in 1683, just about 100 years later, the Austrians took their part with the Prussians and the Russians to dismember Poland completely, and Poland vanished from the map. There was no Poland between the 1790s and the end of the First World War. That is when Poland was reconstituted, and all in that time, when the Industrial Revolution came in the 1800s to Poland, later than it did in your country, then what we see is Jews took their place in the country. It was a vibrant community. It was a huge community. It was a very, very differentiated community.
Now, Edward, on that note, so the roots of Polish life exist before the re-emergence of the state. And it's interesting, you'll know, when you go to do history there, you'll find any document that's before 1914, of course, is part of the Russian Empire, depending on which side of the country you're on. Exactly as you described, geography is destiny. But the last thing you said that I find really fascinating, I think a lot of researchers or people who go and look for their own family often find surprising, is before I landed on that ground, I really had a view of Poland as the Poland of the shtetl. You know, it was kind of a version of Anatevka. And to that extent, I think it's a very limited understanding of both Jewish life and the rich range, the diversity of Jewish life in Poland leading up to the Second World War. Can you just give us, I know it's very difficult in such a short period of time, just some taste of that diversity?
Well, and I'll try to plug as many other people's books as I can and as I go. One thing that I'd recommend in regards to Anatevka is a wonderful book by Max Gross called The Lost
The
Shtetl.
Lost Shtetl, yeah.
Hysterical about a shtetl that wasn't caught by anyone during the Second World War. And it's quite funny and ironic and sad. The Poland, in the Poland that grew up, or the regions and the major cities of Poland at that time, Jews were part of their society. If you go to Lodz, and I think Jonathan lived in Lodz, this was a huge industrial town. And it was the leading textile city. It was the Manchester, if you will, of the Russian Empire. And it was the easternmost town, the westernmost town in the empire. And this is where textiles were. Jews played a major part in the city as major industrialists, also just as shopkeepers and running small textile plants. Of course, Lodz lost its predominance after the end of the Russian Empire in 1918. In cities like Gdansk, or Danzig as it was, Jews were big city folks. Warsaw had, by the Second World War, had 335,000 Jews, which makes it the largest Jewish city, bigger than Berlin, that was 180,000, bigger than Vienna, 180,000, something like that, bigger than even Budapest, which was 225,000 Jews. Warsaw was even bigger. And of course, you had every sort. In Marcy Shore's book, Caviar and Ashes, as well as her second book, which the title is escaping me, she wrote about Jews meeting in coffee houses in Warsaw in 1920, and these were avant-gardists. So you had Jews in every part of society, in literature, in cinema, in film. Obviously, we're talking after Poland was reconstituted in 1918. And yes, we had Jews all over the country. In every town and village, there were Jews, and they were very often the traders.
Mm. And so it's right to say that there was a range of different Jewish experience, different levels of assimilation, for example. Going to Piotrków-Trybunalski, I was surprised to discover in this small town, even in one building, there were Zionists and Lubavitch and Bundists. You know, there's that very famous story about the man who discovers the Jew who's been on a desert island for 10 years. And he's incredibly surprised to find this big structure. And he says, what's that? He says, well, that's a synagogue. And he said, what's this other big structure that you've built? He goes, that's also a synagogue. He says, two? Yeah, he goes, that's the one I don't go to. And so it's sort of a fascinating feature about the range of Jewish life politically and theologically at that time. It was pretty broad, right?
Well, very much so. And I spent between 1985 and 2000, as Maurice said, taking photographs of Jews in Central Europe. Starting in 2000, I started taking pictures away from Jews, which I found took me a lot less film. What I mean by that is I founded an institute called Centropa, and we interviewed over 1,200 elderly Jews still living in Central and Eastern Europe, digitized their family pictures and got them to tell stories. Now, we interviewed 67 Jews in 6 cities all over Poland, and the pictures they paint for us of growing up in Poland are just so refreshing to read, and tragic and horrible, of course, once we get to the Holocaust. But we interviewed a man by the name of Michal Friedman, who spent his last years in Warsaw teaching Yiddish to not, by the way, to not one Jew in the class. He said, go figure. But we'll talk about this interest by Poles in Jewish culture, and as Ruth Gruber wrote, filling the Jewish space. But Michal Friedman lived in Kovel, and he had 3 passions, which was football, soccer, girls, and Hebrew. And he said none of the girls in his class, in his Jewish class, would date a boy unless he could really recite poetry in Hebrew. And this takes us into stories that really bring the community and bring this country alive. Don't forget, 3.5 million Jews lived in Poland on the edge of the Holocaust.
As we come to the edge of the Holocaust, this complex tapestry that you're describing of culture, of assimilation, Jews of every strata of society in Poland at that point, that would be right. Yiddish as a language in some places, but Polish as a first language. Would it be right, before the shadow begins to emerge from the West, it's important to remember that perhaps Jews always lived under that sort of existential threat? Did they believe that that catastrophe could come, would you say?
Well, the short answer is it's complicated. The longer answer is it was when Poland was reconstituted, this giant country that was called Poland was included Ukrainians and Poles and Germans and Jews and Belarusians, all in this country that had never been a country before 1918. Poland then had to lace together rail networks, put together commercial trade, banking, telephone, communications. This is all enormously difficult to do. And under Poland tried democracy. It did not work particularly well. Marshal Pilsudski, strongman, took control and basically made a dictatorship in 1926. But he had no problem at all with a multi-ethnic and multicultural Poland. And the Jews liked him very much. When he died in 1935, we interviewed people who told me that in Radom, all of the kids from the Jewish school would stand by the train tracks singing the Polish national anthem as his funeral train raced past on the way to bury him in the Wawel in Krakow. So, but the shadow was on the wall. The government of Poland that came in after Pilsudski was specifically anti-Semitic. There were anti-Semitic boycotts. Zionism wasn't just an idea, it was a practical solution. And a great many younger Poles wanted to get out of Poland, but then where didn't they want to get out of?
Edward, on that note, it's a big question, and one I think that's going to be woven into some of the questions that I asked Jonathan. And like you always say, like your extraordinary work, you know, it reminds us that nuance is important and it's complex. But to what extent did Jews in Poland have a Jewish identity vis-a-vis perhaps a Polish or Central European identity on the eve of the Shoah?
This would be, in many countries, you were basically, and this is a simplifying thing, you were either Jewish or you were Polish. This is not in every case, and there were a great many Jews who didn't speak a lick of Yiddish and were completely secular and wanted to be socialists. These were the Bundists. They had nothing to do with Zionism. They had nothing to do with religion. And these were people, Bruno Schulz, who wrote Crocodile Shops and Street of Cinnamon Shops, lived in Drohobit. He considered himself absolutely a Pole 100% and one of the leading intellectuals of the country. So you had those, but a great many felt that they would never really fit in. And this has always been the case of the Jew in Europe. Hungary's Jews were very different. Hungary's Jews felt that they were Hungarians first and Jews second. That's a very different beast. It's a very different animal. Whereas in Romania, especially in the north, anti-Semitism was brutal. No one would have felt like a Romanian citizen for the simple reason they couldn't get a Romanian passport.
So, on that note, as we think about the Holocaust in 1939, and it's impossible to get you to summarize it. Numbers don't do it justice. You know, it's where prose ends and poetry begins, and even then we can't really, I think, fathom just the sort of decimation of Jewish life in Poland. But insofar as you can, and it's very difficult, articulate the Jewish experience in Poland in the Shoah. How can you help us with that in such a short period of time?
Well, let's remember that, let's say in Germany, it took the Nazi party 5 years to even begin to implement what they wanted to do from 1933 till 1938, which was Kristallnacht. But Jews weren't killed, and not many Jews were killed in Kristallnacht. That was the signal that they all began to flee, which is where we get World Jewish Relief, which is where we get Kindertransport coming to England of that 10,000 kids. in Austria, they like to say here in Vienna, what took the Germans 5 years to do, it took the Austrians 5 minutes to do, because they came in March of 1938, and then the Jews were thrown out of the windows here, but they weren't deported even then. They weren't put into ghettos. That didn't start until 1941. Poland was a very different beast. The Germans arrived on the 1st of September 1939. The Soviets came in from the other side on September the 17th and dismembered Poland. Remember how we talked about how Poland was wiped off the map from 1795 to 1918? For the second time, there was another partition. Poland disappeared. What was going to happen to the Jews was brutal and unspeakable. First came the ghettos and the Nazi sections, but there was no original idea to murder all the Jews of Poland. That decision had not yet been made. And you can read various historians taking different approaches on this, and I'll leave that for other people to discuss. But what we do know is that first came the ghettos in each of the cities, then later came the concentration camps, and then came the death camps. The death camps, don't forget, started because in June of 1941, when the Germans made their push, Operation Barbarossa, 80 years ago, this June, the largest land invasion in the history of the world, when they went after Eastern Poland and all of the Soviet Union. That is when the killing squads began. Most Jews in those regions were killed with rifles. And that was during that time when the SS met and they decided on the death camps. The death camps didn't exist before January 42, which was when the Wannsee Conference was held on the 20th of January. Then what we had is these Polish Jews were then very quickly sent into Belzec and Treblinka and Auschwitz-Birkenau and Sobibor and the other camps, wiped out. And so by those death camps only lasted for about a year, and then after that, the Germans tried to cover their tracks by burning the ashes, the bodies, the remnants. Poland was liberated, so to speak, by the Soviet army, but where the Soviet army came, they didn't liberate; they occupied, and Poland was dealt a brutal blow by being occupied by the Soviets for another 4 decades. What was left of Poland, I'll just say this last thing, what was left of Polish Jewry, 3 million Jews were murdered during the Holocaust. And this was done by, yes, there were local collaborators. Yes, there were also over 6,000 Poles were identified as righteous Gentiles. So nevertheless, there was a community there after the war, and I'll say something about that next.
Well, Edward, I have to say, you've answered the 2 questions that I was going to ask you. You know, numbers really don't give us a sense, even when you stand on the ground. You say the word 3 million and it feels like a statistic, but those are towns, communities, neshumas, souls. And really the question I was going to ask you from you was to sort of lead into the questions I wanted to begin to ask Jonathan. When I was growing up, I wonder, I suspect it's the case for others who have Polish relatives, I was always told, it was taught, it was handed down, passed down as a seemingly dark but immutable truth that the Poles were worse than the Nazis. That was a very specific thing that was said to me. Can you help us a little bit with the level of complicity and whether that was a uniform experience throughout Poland? That's the first question. And I'm going to do the thing you're not supposed to do as a barrister, but ask you a second question for you to answer before I move to Jonathan, which is this. We certainly know that the experience of those that went back to towns from where they were from, those who survived, seemingly was a universally bad one. Can you speak a little bit to both of those things?
The level of complicity by Poles during the Holocaust was quite awful in many cases, and it's an endlessly complex subject. Jan Gross wrote his book called Neighbors, about the Jews being gathered in a town called Jedwabne, being shoved into a barn, and the barn lit alight. This was not the only incident of its kind. There were plenty of incidents like that. As I said, there were also incidences of Polish families saving Jews. I would never say that the Poles were worse than the Nazis, because that's just wrong. I mean, the no Nazis, no Holocaust, period.
Right.
But post-war in Poland was brutal. It was awful. But it wasn't just Poland. I remember Martha Rich telling me how she came back to her village in Hungary, walking and staggering into town from Auschwitz-Birkenau. People came out of their homes just to slap her on the face. And this would be a Hungarian thing to say, not a Polish thing to say. And she told me, she said, "I'll never forgive them for making me lose the love I had for my country." Now in Poland, you had a house in Kielce where Jews were harbored, all Holocaust survivors, and a kid came back and said the Jews had kidnapped me. The people of Kielce gathered around the house, dragged the Jews out and beat them to death one at a time. There were 46, 47 of them. There were other incidents like that. So there are gruesome things, but let me just move on and say that a great many Jews then left Poland even after 1945. Those that came back decided not to move there. They, by the way, were the Jews who began to reinvigorate the Jewish community of West Germany, not East Germany, but West Germany at the time. And I will just end my remarks by saying that I remember when I made my first trip to Poland in the late 1980s, I had never seen so much anti-Semitic graffiti in my life. I had never seen so many cemeteries that were desecrated. And I had said to myself, "Hum and bug, this place will never be better." And yet, there was a family that named their child after a town in Buckinghamshire. That would be Milton Keynes. He had said, "When the facts change, so do my opinions." And the institute that I run, Centropa, this Jewish Historical Institute, we work in education now, and we work with public schools. We don't have a network anything like what we have in Poland. We have more public school teachers in our network than in any other country. When we do a seminar, we have more people who want to come. We have had exactly 236 public school teachers who come to our programs. 93 of them come from towns of less than 50,000, which means they're former shtetls. There is a memory, there is a desire to leap over those communist decades, to leap over that Nazism and fulfill, as Ruth Grubert said, that Jewish space.
Edward, I have to say, the way that you're describing things is often the way people feel when they've had the chance. I always say it's a gift or a mitzvah to leave having had the experience of being with a Holocaust survivor. You're imbued with a sense of optimism, a sort of sense of understanding where one has to move forward positively in the future, not to forget the past, but to remember it and understand that we have to somehow find simcha and joy in order to build society moving forward. Jonathan, I'm going to introduce you now. It's a real privilege and it's extraordinary to listen to Edward and how he describes the Poland of today and the variety of interests. Can you understand why a lot of people are, like I did before they come to Poland, come with that, I suppose, burden of history, the belief that Poles were universally complicit and that the responsibility in terms of the show has never been thought about, reflective, and they've never had a socially cathartic moment?
Yes, in a short answer, yes. First of all, I just want to take a second to say what an honor it is for me to be here. My relationship with World Jewish Relief goes back a little bit before the JCC opened, so over 13 years. And anything that I may talk about in terms of what our community is going through is really based on what World Jewish Relief has given this community, World Jewish Relief and its supporters, World Jewish Relief and the Connections Committee. So I'm really here. I'm here in many ways because of World Jewish Relief. I think it's not that surprising when we think about world attitudes toward Poland. The greatest tragedy that happened to our people, perhaps ever, happened mostly on technically occupied, but Polish soil. If you want to study the Holocaust, if you want to really go and learn and connect to the Holocaust, you don't go to Berlin, or the first place that you go isn't Berlin. You might eventually go there, but if you want to learn about the Holocaust and you're going to go and take one trip, you're going to get on the plane wherever you are, and you're going to land in Poland, and you're going to learn about the Holocaust because so much of it happened in Poland. So, of course, because so much of it happened here, the Poland is to some degree more than Germany, the place that we associate with the Holocaust. So I think to some degree that's natural, and that sets the stage. So it doesn't surprise me when I hear all of these things. But of course, to say, what I think to me is, the quote that I love that Ed said twice, which is, when the facts change, then the opinions have to change. And the facts on the ground today suggest something else. And people talk about optimism and being so ideologically, predisposed to Poland. Not at all. I've been living here in Poland for 20 years, and the country that I see, in many ways, it has a lot of problems. And sometimes we have to separate Poles from Poland, which is also useful in terms of the Holocaust. What did Poland do as a nation, as opposed to what Poles did? It's complicated, but what's happening here on the ground, and what has been going on really, certainly since 1989, when the system changed and the country regained its independence, is a miracle of historic importance to the Jewish people.
Can you give us some examples of that? And then I'd like to challenge you on 2 points, but give us an example of just the work that you're doing, and some cause for, especially now, as ordinarily we'd be alongside each other listening to this conversation, and just the light of some good news of the work that you do.
Sure. Our JCC is a small JCC. It's not JW3 or one of these giant American JCCs. We have a very small, it wasn't that small when we opened it, but somehow we've outgrown the building. In our humble JCC, we have over 70 non-Jewish volunteers working in our building. When you walk in our building, in the reception, it's not a paid staff member, it's a Polish non-Jew who's greeting you and introducing you to our facility, and to many times to Jewish Krakow. If you come for a Shabbat dinner, the young people who are taking your plates and serving you food and cleaning up are young Polish non-Jews, which is something remarkable. I don't know of really many Jewish institutions of any size in the world that have that much non-Jewish presence in terms of volunteering. There's such an incredible fascination with this Jewish past that was denied people. If you think about it, the Jewish, as Ed spoke about so eloquently, you have 1,000 years of Jewish history, and this dialogue that had been going on between the majority and the minority in Poland, the majority Polish community and the minority Jews, for almost 1,000 years, ups and downs, good times and bad. It's worth always taking a moment to say the Holocaust primarily happened in Poland because that's where the Jews were. But the Jews were essentially in Poland because they were welcome here when they were kicked out of many other countries, some to remain nameless in Europe. So
Ed, as you rightly described, sort of eloquently described what it felt like to first arrive in the Poland that he first found, and almost this shock he talks about of just the pervasiveness of anti-Semitism. Some of us, many of us perhaps, are concerned by the perception that Poland has moved to the right. And let's just give you 2 examples. There was a Warsaw mayoral race. You know that at football games, it's true in this country, but certainly true in Poland, anti-Semitic slurs exist on terraces and are generally accepted. And also there's a law of equivalency. I don't think it translates very well. And it's something that those of us who are engaged in Holocaust education are concerned about. And it seems to be a reason for pessimism as Poland moves forward politically. Why is that wrong? Are we wrong?
Well, I think, first of all, I think what Ed said, that it was that he never encountered so much anti-Semitic graffiti, not so much anti-Semitism. And I think it's worth drawing a distinction between those things. I've been here 20 years. I've never encountered personally any anti-Semitism. Our building has never been the target of any anti-Semitism. I think the reason to be optimistic, although there are many things that this government does, almost everything I should say, this government does, I personally find fault with, and I would say much of our Jewish community finds fault with a lot of things this government does, not necessarily on Jewish issues, just on issues in terms of general personal freedom, freedom of the press, issues dealing with women, LGBT rights. You know, the government is in many ways atrocious, but what's happening in Poland is not necessarily government-led. These young people who are volunteers in my JCC are not there because of a government program. They're there because they, as young people, feel that the country lost something when it lost its Jewish presence, when the Jewish heart was ripped out of their country, and they have an opportunity not only to study history books and to learn about some almost vanished people, they have an opportunity to work hand in hand with the Jewish community today and help us rebuild.
Before I put questions to the floor, Jonathan, the Zoom. If you could articulate or describe what we'd meet in terms of Jewish life today, in terms of its size and its activism, and just a kind of the colorful sense of what we'd experience if we visited Poland today. How can you describe it for us, those of us who haven't been?
I think it's you have all the color and diversity of pre-war Poland on a vastly smaller scale. Yeah, I think what's really remarkable is that you have almost everything happening. You have so many firsts. So we opened a preschool 3 years ago, which is the first Jewish community preschool to open in Poland since the war. You have Jewish clubs, sports clubs, Maccabi being reconstituted in Warsaw. You have so many, bar mitzvahs happening, weddings. You have just an entire range of activities of the Jewish community, and I should say a Jewish community that feels very safe. The security that that people watching this, people that are on this Zoom watching, will come to see as normal in the UK are things that we don't have in Poland. There's very little security. We feel very safe in our community centers and our synagogues and throughout our communal life.
Well, I think we're going to open it up to the Zoom. One just small thing, it's really a personal question, so it's question as privilege. There seems to be a sense in which Poland's moving to a place where, in terms of its educational policy, that there's a competition for victimhood of the Polish war experience vis-a-vis the Jewish experience. And before I open the questions up to everybody, can you help us a little bit with that? And again, is that something that we should be concerned about?
Yeah, it's, you ask a very good question. It's something that I've thought a lot about and that we deal with a lot here in Poland, that the German Jewish experience is a much cleaner transaction. Germany says, we did this, we acknowledge it, we're sorry, we offer you these things, which is what we can do, and then the Jews can sort of accept it or not. We support Israel, we vote with Israel in the UN. With Poland, it's a little more complicated. Poland was invaded by Germany, and then Poland, the Holocaust happened with some Polish help, but some help also from French and every other country in Europe. So I think that Poland, to some degree, is willing to, has been, and this government has got pushed back against it, and that's really where the problem is. So things were going in a certain direction educationally, and then for the last 5-6 years, this government is kind of pushed back. But overall, if I'm taking a 30-year view, I would say that Poles have an understanding that Jews suffered more during World War II, that the Holocaust was its own unique event, but they also expect us as Jews to acknowledge to some degree their suffering. And nothing insults Poland more. Nothing is more hurtful to Poles that when they're seen as worse than the Germans. They can, not that that insults them even, they can't understand how when they were the ones who were invaded and 3 million non-Jewish, the number is 2.5 million, maybe 3 million non-Jewish Poles were killed in World War II. They can't understand how they are seen sometimes by us as equal to or worse than the Nazis. So I think that we Jews need to sometimes, and I'm again not absolving Poland or Poles of many different crimes and sins, but we often as Jews need to do a better job, certainly in Poland, of acknowledging the suffering of another nation.
Well, on that note, and knowing confidently, and I have to say, because I try to have the integrity of full disclosure, I should say, I have a Jewish identity, but 3 or 4 weeks ago, I became a Polish citizen as well. So I have this dual identity, and it was a complex decision, to be sure. And so I'm hoping the two of you have been so clear, so helpful, and so enriching in my understanding in such a short period of time of the history and the current presence of Jewish life in that part of the world. And I say that part of the world because Edward correctly reminds us that it's only been a country intermittently for a period of time, and an identity consequently for an intermittent period of time too. I now turn to our president, Maurice Helfgott, to curate our questions, and hopefully they'll be as insightful and as clear as you've been so far.
Thank you so much, gentlemen. That was really wonderful. And we've got lots of questions coming in, so we'll try and do them rapid fire. Just a couple of, can you describe what form is the government in Poland at the moment? How many Jews there are? Are there any schools for Jewish children? And what is the nature of the community? Is there a lot of marriage between Jews and Poles?
Yeah, oh, got it. What form is the government? How many Jews, what type of schools, and intermarriage?
Done.
The government is wannabe fascist. Is that an actual type of? The government is a right-leaning government that is following. I think all you need to know about the Polish government is that they often point to Hungary as their model. So they are trying to all the general democratic freedoms that most of us appreciate are ones that they are trying to take away. But I think that they're overplaying their hand, and we'll see if this government will stay in power that much longer. How many Jews? This is a very difficult question. I think we, without going down the rabbit hole of saying how do you define a Jew, but I will say that if you can say how many Poles today have at least one Jewish grandparent, which are based on the Nuremberg laws, or if you want to make Aliyah to Israel, I would say that number is without question 100,000. They don't all know about it. They're not all active. Some may never find out. Some who find out might not get involved, but you certainly have the raw material. You can start with 3.5 million Jews, which is the conservative estimate, 1939. You can't go from 3.5 million to numbers of 5, 10, 15,000 today. The math doesn't add up. So people are out there with Jewish roots, and if we're able to reach them, then we will. In terms of schools, you have a Jewish school in Warsaw, and you have a Jewish kindergarten in Krakow, and there's a sort of quasi-Jewish school in Wrocław, but it depends on how Jewish school has to be for us to consider it a Jewish school. So you do have some form of formal Jewish education. And the last one was about intermarriage. In terms of intermarriage, I can tell you that certainly in Krakow, there is much less intermarriage than there was, because before the JCC opened, it was almost completely random for two Jews to meet each other. So I think intermarriage went from 100% to some number less than that. There are now places like our JCC in Krakow, like the JCC in Warsaw, which opened. There are now places where Jews can meet other Jews, which obviously facilitates marriage.
Fabulous. And we have another question about how many of the Jews effectively are coming out as Jews, people who knew they were Jews, but effectively came out. Is that what's happening?
Yes, that's what's happening, without question. If I would take a look at our Hillel, which we have, your International Students Organization run that we do at the JCC, Hillel, then there are probably 70 students, maybe 25 of them are from Ukraine. You have a lot of Ukrainians moving to Poland, which is also an interesting, giving also some type of lifeblood to the Jewish community. As these, Jews, we don't pay attention to borders historically. But of those 45 remaining Polish Jews, I would say 35 to 40 of them grew up without knowing they were Jewish, found out somewhere with one of those aha discovery moments along the way. So the vast majority of young people, certainly in Krakow, that are involved Jewishly, did not grow up knowing they were Jewish from birth.
So we've got a fabulous question from a gentleman called Keith Preston, who said that he met you before you became director of the JCC, and he doesn't remember you having a particular calling leading you to become director. But since then, you've become an international speaker, an advocate for Polish Jews, and obviously the JCC in particular. So this question is for you, but I'm also interested in, could apply very similarly to Edward and perhaps even for Rob, who visited the country and have a growing passion for the cause. Personally, what has driven that?
Well, I think Keith knows I was an unformed lump of clay until I met him when he set me on my path to be the director of the JCC. Now, I think that, first of all, I think I'm a bit of a contrarian. And this idea that everybody associates Poland so closely with death and destruction and tragedy bothers me. This country that I've lived in for 20 years at this point. My wife is Polish. My wife is a Polish Jew who found out she was Jewish in her 20s. So this idea that a place that's so important to Jews, the place that was the center of the Jewish world for hundreds of years, the fact that we're cut off from that we define that only through the tragedy of the Holocaust, I think is tragic for Polish Jews, but I think even more so, it's a loss for the Jewish people. And on top of that, if I could just add one other thing, at a time of increased anti-Semitism, the idea of the rebirth of Jewish life at in Poland, headquartered in many ways, I would say, in Krakow, because I'm not objective and I'm in Krakow, but headquartered here down the road from Auschwitz, I would say that the incredible message that sends both to those who would do us harm and even more important to ourselves of the internal nature of the Jewish people. If Jewish life can thrive, not only survive or squeak by, if Jewish life can thrive here in Krakow, down the road from Auschwitz, with Jews and non-Jews working together to rebuild, then I think it gives us an incredible amount of optimism, especially at a difficult time.
Thank you, Jonathan. Edward, what drives your passion?
Well, I would say, first of all, my passion is not Jews in Poland. My passion is that I started a Jewish Historical Institute specifically to preserve Jewish memory in the lands where the Holocaust took place. And this is what Centropa did by interviewing over 1,200 people, Central and Eastern Europe, and digitizing their family photographs. Our goal from the beginning, when Centropa was founded in 2000, was to preserve Jewish memory and to make sure that it would be available for those who want to study it in the decades to come. We got sidetracked, so to speak, by working in education. No, I wouldn't say sidetracked. We moved into education, but I want to see that Jewish memory in small towns in Poland, but our biggest country by far is Ukraine, where we have over 300 teachers working with us. I want to see Jewish memory remembered. I want to see the Jewish story in all of these countries remembered by the people who live there. It's only by school kids in Romania, Serbia, Greece, and Hungary, and the places we work, only by them looking into Jewish history and creating projects and making and feeling that Jewish history and heritage is their own, is the only way that we're going to be remembered.
Thank you, Edward. And Rob, I mean, you put it out there. You struggled with it. You said 3 or 4 weeks ago you became a Polish citizen. Was it like Jonathan to be a contrarian, or what was your motivation?
The simple answer, of course, is that it gifted me EU citizenship, which after Brexit mattered and may matter much more. Who knows? I wrote a column talking about the sense of existential insecurity as a Jew after Brexit and wanting to be mobile. I think that's something that, as even a third generation survivor, you inherit to some extent. So having that passport mattered, but it's also something that both Edward talked about and then Jonathan really spoke to as well. This idea that Poland, or one country, is one monolithic political presence. Just as much as there are articulating positions politically on the right, there are a huge amount, more than in this country, I should add, of young, motivated activists on the other side of the political spectrum. The notion that this is one thing, as opposed to a range, a plurality of political opinion, is a pretty limited and one-dimensional view of modern Poland. But also, again, really talking about what Jonathan was speaking to as well, which is this, that I remember in 1997 landing in Poland and being alongside my grandfather, I'm not sure if you had this experience too, Maurice, but hearing him speak Polish for the first time was a real shock to the system. The idea that certainly he had a Jewish identity, and that was his primary one, but it was undoubtedly a Polish one too, by virtue of the language he spoke, the food he ate, the clothes he wore, the smells, and the cities which informed and curated his existence. And so to that extent, the history of the Jewish people has been one of dovka, that Yiddish word where you externally don't you don't have the right, you don't have the capacity to determine and to shape our narrative. That's for us to do, dovka. And I think there's something delightfully dovka which speaks to the underlying part of the Jewish soul and the Jewish presence in the diaspora, dovka. To go and get that Polish passport, and certainly to build and to rebuild a Jewish community, certainly in Krakow, but also beyond that city too. And dovka is probably their one word that would describe certainly my grandfather and maybe all of the survivors.
Well, certainly, my father's very passionate British citizen, but speaks a fluent, and has always spoken a fluent Polish, has always been very close and built friendships and relationships in Poland. And despite his experience, obviously, of surviving not just the concentration camps, but also going back to his hometown to find his family and almost being killed by local Poles, he has always taken the view that you judge people on who they are, not because they're Polish or because they're Jewish or German or anything else, and that the behavior of people, often driven by circumstance, is not as a result of their nationality. And for me, what has been very interesting about this conversation is brought to life the context of a long and vibrant history of the Jews in Poland, but also a sense of optimism and energy and rebirth of a community of which World Jewish Relief played an important part in terms of international humanitarian support, but which you are actively driving and generating, and for which we are really very, very grateful. I would like to thank the three of you for giving generously of your time to produce a fascinating evening. I'd like particularly also to thank Linda Rosenblatt and Jean Marks on behalf of the Connections Committee, who have conceived and made this series possible. I hope you will all join us, and I hope you will tell your friends that we are going from Poland to Georgia, to Uganda, and to Bosnia over the next few weeks, and you will join us doing that. I think you mentioned, Rob, I think you mentioned the archives which you saw, which World Jewish Relief has about your father. And if I can risk the technology here, 1 second.
And I also advise people to go to Edward's organization and his wonderful book as well, which I think you should hold up, because it's definitely worth a read for people wanting to know more about Poland.
This is one of our books.
Read the title, Edward.
The Polish Jewish Source Book, but you can only get it from Centropa. It's like a one-stop shopping for you. But also your website with the photographs is so moving. So. Yes, please look at centropa.org. Well, look at that.
Excellent. So this is an example, just to want everybody to see. This is a particular example from the archives of somebody called Lisa Jura. This is the Home Office permit number 874. This was their date of birth. This is their religion, the camp they were in, their parents, and then which of the World Jewish Relief committees were responsible for them, and lots of information about what happened to them, what their relationship with people were, and essentially this is an archive file. And World Jewish Relief has tens of thousands of these files on individuals who came principally from Germany and Austria, but also, of course, the boys who came mostly from Poland, but also from Hungary and other places after the war. And I would very much encourage any of you, if you are connected to refugees from Europe before or slightly after the war, and you think that World Jewish Relief may have those archives, please contact us. And there is a lot of opportunity to dig into those archives, and please pass the message along that there is that opportunity. And when we send out an email after this session and about the new events, you'll find a link to find out about the archives, and you can also find it on our website. So this is the bit where the advertising comes in. World Jewish Relief is an international humanitarian organization providing on the ground, hands-on support for its partners in Poland, in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe, and also around the world, and also in the United Kingdom, where we do very key work helping refugees improve their livelihoods. I've known about the organization all my life because, of course, as we said earlier, I'm here in part because, in no small part, because World Jewish Relief brought my dad here. But in the last month, as I've got to know the organization, I've been extraordinarily impressed, not just by the fantastic support of the trustees and the many committees, but really the professional management of the organization led by Paul Anticoni. And I'm going to give you two examples. You've heard a lot about the JCC, which is a fantastic example, but I'm giving you two examples that I've learned about recently. The first is that World Jewish Relief had the foresight and strategic nous to build partnerships around the world so that when there were disasters, World Jewish Relief could move quickly, so with partners could deliver support and aid in emergency to people who need it. Just last month in Indonesia, in Sulawesi, there was a major earthquake. World Jewish Relief's partner was already proven, audited, working together on the ground. Together, we applied for an international grant of £60,000, and immediately World Jewish Relief support, enabled by its funds provided by our supporters, is being delivered there. That is super professional, super strategic. Another example is the program that is happening in the UK. Today, World Jewish Relief's help with livelihood and getting into employment for resettled refugees is the biggest and most effective program provided to the British government in the UK. So it's very meaningful that those of us who were ourselves descendants of refugees brought by World Jewish Relief are now able to support an organization that helps refugees coming to this country today. All of that requires a great deal of funding, a great deal of support. It doesn't matter how much you are able to give, it doesn't matter how often you are able to give, but if you are able to make a contribution and connect to the organization, it is very much appreciated. And as I'm learning, it really is making a difference and is very, very professionally and effectively and strategically deployed. So, advert over. I know there are quite a few other questions we haven't unfortunately been able to have time to answer this evening. Rob?
Sorry, I would say that, yeah, thank you for having me. As I said at the beginning, it's a privilege to be part of this family. As you know, I wouldn't be here but for World Jewish Relief. And I started at the beginning of the remarks I was making, introducing the brilliant Edward and Jonathan, who I think should have their own documentaries, both of them. I was sort of brimming with ideas so that the world can hear more from both of them. But nowadays, people's anti-Semitism and the views that they have of the world don't sit in the logical cortex of their brain. It sits in the hemisphere where emotion is or identity is, and very often confronting somebody with dark views or perhaps conspiracy theories, you're not really going to do well by throwing logic at them. But what you can do is give really good examples of who we are as a people. And I think WJR is the best of us. So thank you for having me tonight. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to as many questions, but you can find Edward and Jonathan online. Centropa is an incredible resource. Although when you start, you won't get off it. Trust me, it's extraordinary. And Jonathan, what a privilege to hear you, both of you actually speak so optimistically. And that optimism really permeates WJR as well. So thank you for having me as well.
Thank you all very much. Have a very good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.